All right, Ben Portnoy from the state back in action at SEC Media Days. How you been, brother?
I'm good. Getting my feet under me here. It's Monday, right? It's a long week, so you got to pace yourself a little bit. But it's good. It's good. Good to be back and good to see people.
So let me ask you this. This is something I've kind of been asking a lot of people for the teams they cover specifically. What's something you want to learn about South Carolina from this event?
You know, I think something that I'm really interested to watch, and it's maybe not even necessarily about South Carolina, but more like third-party viewing, is I'm curious to see the reception that Spencer Rattler gets, frankly. I think that, he's a guy that gets talked about so much in sort of the construct of college football and maybe took a step back from that being at South Carolina last year versus sort of the spotlight and sort of the scrutiny that he got at Oklahoma 2 years ago now. Him being in the spotlight, him being at SEC Media Days, I kind of think that there's going to be a little bit of a circus around it when he does get here, and I think that that's going to be – it's just going to be interesting to see sort of the reception, sort of what sort of the questions that he gets asked, how he handles it. But, obviously we as local reporters have dealt with Spencer a lot in the last year, and he's been really great. But it'll be really interesting to see him sort of back in the center of college football again a little bit when he gets here on Thursday.
Were you kind of surprised that he decided to come back?
Definitely. I think it was definitely a real decision. I think that, to me and sort of the perception had always been that it was going to be a one-year experiment, and it was either going to work or it wasn't, and everyone was going to kind of go their opposite ways at the end because that's generally how those things go, especially with a transfer in that sort of setting. But, I think that when you looked at it, like Spencer's a guy that he's going to get drafted on his arm talent alone, whether he plays well or not. I mean, that's just the kind of arm talent that he has, but those last two games made you think, the last two games of the regular season, I should say, made you think, okay, if he puts this together for a full season, what does that look like? What's he capable of down the stretch? Those things. And now, I don't think anyone here is necessarily saying that Spencer's going to be, what he was against Tennessee or what he was against Clemson every single game next year. But I think the thought is that, okay, if he can go piece that together more consistently or be a little bit more prolific, be a little more comfortable more of the year than not, I think that makes a big difference. You're talking about a guy who's a, second-round pick maybe or a first-round pick who plays really, really well versus a, fourth, fifth, mid-round guy.
Right.
And I think that's the biggest thing that stood out to me, at least in terms of why he would want to come back. Now, that said, again, I think I was still a little surprised that he came back, but it makes for some interesting talking points this time of year, that's for sure.
Well, the old adage, quarterbacks get too much blame and too much credit. But this year, I think it's kind of fair given that, lack of depth at running back, questions on the O-line. They do got Juice Wells, who may be the best receiver in the entire SEC, Trey Knox, but it feels, and this is so simplistic, but it feels like South Carolina's going to go as far as Spencer can take them.
Yeah, I think so, because I think that, I think we even talked about this at Media Days last year, is like, at some point Spencer's just going to go win you a football game. And last year it happened to be the Tennessee game, and you could argue even the Clemson game a little bit too. And that may happen again this year, but the way that this team is structured as is, I think they've got talent. It's the skill positions, especially at wide receiver and tight end, but the running back situation's a little bit questionable. Like, you're at the point where you're either going to see it or you're not with Spencer, and that's not necessarily a knock. It's just a matter of that's kind of where we're at in his career and his progression, right? Like, it's either going to work for most of the season or it's not. And I think that was the thing that was, kind of frustrating for a lot of people, I think, to watch last year, was that you saw it in spurts. And, even the games where he wasn't playing well, you saw it in moments. You saw it in a half or a quarter. I mean, the Kentucky game, he was kind of all over the place in the first half. And it wasn't necessarily a thought of, okay, are you going to make a change at quarterback? But it was kind of just like, okay, what are we watching here kind of thing?
Yeah.
And then turns around and goes 8 of 12 for 135 yards and 2 or 3 touchdowns in the second half. And South Carolina goes and beats Kentucky at Kentucky for the first time in almost a decade. And, so you saw it in spurts, and then obviously you saw it over the course of a full game against Tennessee, against Clemson, and frankly even against Notre Dame in the bowl game for most of it. But I think that if you look at South Carolina as they're constructed, this is Spencer Rattler's team. If this team is going to go jump up to whatever, let's say it's 8, 9 wins, whatever that, sort of high-end mark is, it's going to be because of what Spencer does. It's because he goes and wins you maybe 2 games instead of 1 like he did last year.
Yeah.
And I think, it's fair to say that, what this team can be, at least on its highest end, I think falls on Spencer.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you real quick, because I've always been a Marshawn Lloyd fan. And the fact that he left, I think that was the biggest surprise for me. Can you take us a little behind the locker room there? What was potentially going on in his mind and why he had to leave that campus?
Yeah, I think for Marshawn it was a question of, I think that if you ask Shane Beamer, if you ask people in the program, they'll tell you, they felt good about Marshawn coming back and, went home and talked through some things with his family and decided that he just needed a fresh start. And sometimes the kid needs that, after however many years and an injury, a pretty serious injury.
Yeah.
His first year here at South Carolina, had dealt with some injury stuff down the stretch in the last season as well. So I think there's something to be said about playing and just getting a fresh start, and that happens. And, whether that's the case always, certainly there's other things going on in college football that can be reasons for guys to leave, but I'll leave it there. But I'll try a little lightly. But
sticking on that theme, the portal helped South Carolina immensely last season. This season, do you think? I mean, they still added guys. It's not like they didn't add anybody. But do you think it'll be a overall plus or overall minus the portal?
That's the thing is, I think the last 2 years, South Carolina has definitely been a portal winner.
Right.
I think it's been pretty easy to say they've won in the portal. And, Shane Beamer's first year, it was kind of maybe a few more lower key guys as far as star power, but they got guys that really filled roles and really played well. Carlin Splatell is a guy they got from a Division II school and ended up being a starting nickel for most of the year and is now still, bouncing around the NFL a little bit. So guys like that. Year 2, you get Spencer Rattler, you get Austin Stogner from Oklahoma, a couple other guys. That was a high-level, talent. This group, I think, is going to be some of that. Trey Knox is a guy that I think can end, if you look up at the end of the year and Trey Knox is your second-team All-SEC tight end, I can buy into that. What you do have, though, this year is the first time that you've had some guys leave that were really big pieces, I think. Jordan Birch is a guy that left. We just mentioned it. Marshawn Lloyd's a guy that left. Jaheim Bell left. Gilbert Edmond, your other starting defensive end, left. So, some of those guys, maybe it's a matter of getting a fresh start, and that's fine, and coaches are maybe ready for, it's an amicable thing. It's just hey, I've been here for 3 years. I'm ready for something different. That's fine. That happens, and I think that sometimes we lose that in the grand scheme of the transfer portal. Look, are there guys leaving just because they can leave? Yeah, sure, that exists. But I think you're losing a lot of – this was the first year where you felt like they lost some guys that were maybe difference makers. Now, they've done well in the portal. They've developed guys. I think you've seen South Carolina, this coaching staff has done a pretty good job of maximizing talent for the most part. So we'll see. I think they're kind of at a net zero. I don't want to say it's a loss because I do think there's some guys they brought in that are going to be really good pieces. I mean, I mentioned Trey Knox. Nick Gargiulo, who they brought in on the offensive line from Yale, I think is a guy that I've circled that I think may surprise some people and maybe a really important piece on the line this year. Mario Anderson at running back from Newberry, from right up the road, is a D2 transfer, but he was a finalist for the Harlan Hill Trophy last year, the Division II Heisman to characterize it, I guess. So at running back, so maybe he ends up seeing a lot of time and ends up being a really big piece. But so you lost some high end guys, and I think they're probably lean more toward a loser than a winner right now, just because of sort of. You don't necessarily have the sexy names at the top of it that you brought in, but I do think there's some guys that are going to fill out some big roles and be productive. I think it's definitely it's a little bit of a different spot than they were in maybe a year ago or 2 years ago for sure.
Are we gonna get some sort of hype reel before Beamer shows up?
I keep thinking about that. I'm like, man, the last 2 years. 2 years ago, it was going and recreating the Spurrier with what was it, Taco Bell, I guess, or Arby's, whatever it was.
Their marketing team's great. I mean, they're fantastic.
I don't know what they've got cooked up, but I've stopped trying to predict it because I've tried and I can't get out ahead of that one. I'm just sort of like.
I think my favorite one's the speed limit one. When
speed limit one's good. Hey, as an Office fan, I was super in on that. That was impressive. I think underrated. The one the Full House intro video.
Yeah.
That gets lost in the shuffle a little bit because it was in a dead period. But I was in on that one. I thought that was a good one. So they've done some good stuff.
Pressure is probably not the right word because when we hear pressure, you think job security and things like that. But how important is that Clemson game for Beamer to, everyone's on board with Shane Beamer right now, but you lose to Clemson, again, they're not going to be calling for his job, but they're going to be, I think those fans are going to be pissed.
It's funny because, as you guys know as well as anyone, right? College football is a what have you done for me lately thing.
Right.
Listen, Dan Mullen went and won the SEC East and then was fired, 2 years late, less than 2 years later? I mean, that's just the reality of college football, and it's crazy, and that's a whole other discussion we can talk about for 6 hours. But I think that when you look at that Clemson game and what it means to people in the state, it's obviously the game that everyone circles, and there's definitely sort of the feeling of, you could go 1-11, but make sure you beat Clemson. And certainly South Carolina fans more than that, and Clemson fans want more than that, obviously. But I do think that it's definitely a turning point. I think that last year was a big moment like that. It's not nothing that was the first time in 7 years that South Carolina's beaten Clemson, and I think it's the first time that I think I'm curious what Clemson becomes, right? You bring in Garrett Riley. You've got a quarterback back that you feel really good about. You're going to have some skill position players. But, I think Dabo's in a really strange place of they're not recruiting. I mean, they're recruiting really well right now, but I think that it's definitely there's an opening there, and South Carolina really opened that door with that win last year in Death Valley, and especially coming off the Tennessee win, like the way that finishes out a season, like that's a big deal. And I think that if you're South Carolina, if you're Shane Beamer, if you go in and beat Clemson 2 years in a row, that becomes a real conversation, right? It's not a one-off, okay, South Carolina got us this year, whatever. Like, that becomes a real conversation of, okay, I mean, are these teams on equal playing field? And is that a product of South Carolina ascending? Is it a product of Clemson taking a step back? Tough to say, right? But I do think that becomes a real conversation, and I think that it, certainly it doesn't hurt job security in this business to beat your rival every year.
Well, the old stereotype, real quick, of a coach that refuses to adapt. I think old Dabo, NIL, transfer portal. So I think he's losing his grip.
Well, I like the momentum too. The way in, even though the bowl game didn't go as expected or as we want, we can still pinpoint why it didn't go.
Yeah.
I just think the way they closed with Tennessee, with Clemson, how important does this North Carolina game be? With all this momentum behind you, and you could come away with egg on face, so.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, South Carolina's schedule is nuts. And, I mean, if you guys look at it, like, their first 5 weeks are you've got UNC, you've got at Georgia, you're at Tennessee, you're home against a Mississippi State team that I think I'm probably higher on Mississippi State than most people. But, like, if you tell me that Mississippi State wins 8 or 9 games this year, I'm buying it. Like, I think they're going to be pretty good. I don't think people realize that.
That's a touchy subject, apparently, Mississippi State. Yeah.
Let me tell you, after 2 years in Starkville, I'm plenty familiar. But I do think that, like, the first 4 games of that schedule, there's a world where South Carolina starts the season 1-4, and things soften up on the back end. And if you get, but like that North Carolina game, that Mississippi State game, I mean, I'd argue even the Tennessee game. Like, if South Carolina gets through that first 5 game stretch at 2-3 or 3-2, they should feel really good about where they're at. And I think that's, South Carolina fans will tell you, or Shane Beamer will tell you, hey, we want to win all 5 games. And, okay, great, that's fine. But the reality is they're probably not going to go beat Georgia in Athens. Sorry, it's just not going to happen. And you're probably going to lose one of those games against Mississippi State, Tennessee, or North Carolina. And, like you mentioned, North Carolina being the first game of the season. Weird things happen in first games of the season. If you told me that game ends up like 54-52, I kind of buy it. I mean, Spencer Rattler's probably going to throw the ball 67 times or something. Drake May probably is going to do the same thing. So it's going to be a fun game. Like, that game's got really sort of like weird, sicko college football vibe to it. So I think it's going to be crazy. But I think, if South Carolina goes and wins that game, they should feel really good about themselves, because I think that, they should be favored at home against Mississippi State. They play Furman in there. I mean, you're sitting at 3-2 coming out of that stretch. You should feel pretty dang good about where you're going the rest of the way.
Speaking of your time in Mississippi, did you ever hear someone say it's too small to be its own country, but it's too big to be an insane asylum? That's what they say about Mississippi. Can you verify that?
I can't verify that. Listen, I will say I love my time in Mississippi, and I will go to war for the Egg Bowl. I love the Egg Bowl.
That's our favorite game.
I grew up in the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry. Both my parents are Michigan grads. Like, I grew up in Big Ten football, but I make my family every year now on Thanksgiving watch the Egg Bowl, because it is my favorite thing. Weird stuff always happens. It is the best. I loved it. So it's it's a crazy rivalry. It makes college football fun for sure.
Are you sensing how great of a rivalry is developing between South Carolina and Tennessee? Because I think because we're Tennessee guys, like South Carolina guys, they just bombard us every day with that score. I'm just wondering if you're sensing that as well.
I think it's fun. I think it makes it fun, and I think that the fact that Tennessee's been, in a place where I think Tennessee's back to being, first of all, like, majorly relevant in college football. Not that they're not talked about, but I think to a point where the on-field stuff backs it up.
Yeah.
I think South Carolina has sort of rebuilt a little bit from sort of the tail end of Muschamp, and I think that makes it that both these programs are. I think it's easy. I think you have to say that Tennessee is ahead of where South Carolina is, just based off the fact that you go and win 10 games, you beat Clemson in a bowl game, et cetera. Like, Tennessee's probably a half step ahead of where South Carolina is, even though South Carolina did win that football game. But I do think it makes it fun because I think the teams are on similar trajectories. South Carolina's maybe, I guess what's the best way to say it, like half a season behind maybe, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it fun, and I think it makes it a fun rivalry and all of that. And I think it's, more of a true rivalry than if the SEC wants to make, South Carolina and A&M a permanent rivalry, fine, but South Carolina Tennessee makes a little more sense to me.
It's kind of crazy because South Carolina is turning into Tennessee Twitter. I've noticed. Like, they hate everybody. You say something about Missouri, there's South Carolina. You say something about Kentucky. So I want, on that note,
my mentions would back you up on that too, probably. But
like, which game would be more important for them? Kentucky, Missouri? I don't want to put Tennessee in there because it's its own little thing. But out of those two teams, which ones do you think is more important for South Carolina to win?
I think it's got to be Missouri because the thing that no one talks about is Eli Drinkwitz is 4-0 against South Carolina, dating back to when he was at App State. I mean, he's won 3 straight games against South Carolina and Missouri. He won the last game he played against South Carolina at App State in 18, I guess. I mean, that is a game that every year South Carolina circles and folks there say, hey, this should be a win. And I would agree that is a game that I think South Carolina should win more years than not. And they just haven't won it. And I think that it's one of those games that it alleviates so much pressure in some of those other games and makes those windows just a little bit wider for you when you're playing the game of, okay, you're going to win this game, you're going to win that game, whatever. Right. Like, if you're South Carolina, that is a game that you need to dominate that sort of side of things, and they just haven't. And that's, for one reason or another, and certainly there's been some wonky games in there, and, it's hard to really fault South Carolina, say 2 years ago, right, when they're in there with a third-string quarterback and doing what they're doing, and frankly, the fact that team won 7 games is still crazy to me. But, props to Shane Beamer and that staff, because that was wild. I mean, that was a heck of a job. But, so there's stuff like that. But the way that they just, you're 5-2 going into a Missouri game last year, and folks are upset that, they're not ranked or right on the tail end of being ranked, and then you come and kind of, trip over yourself against a Missouri team that had looked kind of whatever for most of the year and, ends up winning, 5 games? Like, that's the thing that I think has been a problem for South Carolina. I think that's why I circled the Missouri game. I think you got it done against Kentucky last year, so maybe it's recency bias a little bit. But and I think Kentucky also, too, is the other part of that, I would say, is that Kentucky's better than where Kentucky was a decade ago. Right. I mean, I think it's impossible to ignore how good of a job that Mark Stoops has done, and even with a step back last year. I mean, Kentucky winning 7 games being a disappointment, let's be real. Talking about that 10 years ago, people would say you're crazy. Yeah. I mean, Kentucky is in a point where they should be at a bowl game most years, or more years than not. And there's years where they're winning 8 games with Lynn Bowden running around at quarterback. They're winning 10 games twice in the last, 6 years, 5 years? I mean, Kentucky is in a different state of a program than where Missouri is right now. Right. And I think that's why, to me, the Missouri game is always and has been such a disappointment to me in the last 2 years, at least under Shane Beamer.
Yeah. What do you think it says about Shane Beamer that guys like to carry on Joyner, switching positions? He had that big bowl game you referenced. Luke Doty's another one, touted quarterback. He got some reps at receiver. Now he's back. I mean, these guys usually don't stay in college football. Is that more, do you think, Shane Beamer's program, or you think those are just unique individuals that maybe they don't want to leave?
I don't know if they're working on their doctorates at this point or what, but no, I mean, I think that both guys are pretty selfless guys, for one. At least the 2 guys you use as examples. I think that, I think it's both. I think it's those guys are guys that want to play for South Carolina, want to be a part of the program, all of that. But I do think it's a product of Shane Beamer. I mean, when you look at, certainly I mentioned some of those guys that left in the transfer portal, but South Carolina really hasn't been hit too hard as far as attrition goes outside of – I mean, this was the first year – if you look back at the 2 years before with Shane Beamer and sort of the first 2 years under his watch and guys that had transferred out, I mean, there's probably – I don't have the number in front of me off the top of my head, but I think it's 4, maybe 5 guys in those 2 classes transferred to other Power 5 schools, and that's out of 35, 40 guys that transferred out. I say that to mean that they're not losing a lot of guys that are necessarily transferring up or going somewhere else because they feel like they can have a better opportunity. It's a lot of guys transferring down a level, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a product of what it is, and I think that speaks to Shane Beamer's staff has been able to retain talent, the high-level talent that they have for the most part, and I think that it speaks to kind of how people feel about the program, what they feel like is going on inside the program and sort of the vibe of it and everything else that goes into it. And, certainly winning helps as well. So it's you mix all those things together, you get a lot of that.
Well, there's a lot of special environments in the SEC. And, I mean, a lot of schools claim, we're top 5, top 10. But when it hits right, Willie B, at night, undoubtedly, in my mind, top 10 scene in college football. What makes it so special on a Saturday night like that Tennessee game?
Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, I've described it this way a couple of times. It's just when those towels get going and everything. I mean, it looks like an avalanche. I mean, it really does. Like, it envelops the whole stadium, and the energy's there. And obviously, the new light show that they've put in is really cool and fun. It's a really cool environment, and I think it's a little bit underrated as far as like nationally. I think people talk about Williams-Brice, but I think because of what South Carolina's been as a program largely in its history, it's maybe a little bit underhyped. But it's really cool. I think that you've got a really passionate fan base that I think that certainly there's folks that'll tell you that South Carolina should go win a national championship every year, but I do think that South Carolina fans are generally somewhat realistic. I think it's as realistic as SEC fans can be, right? As realistic as SEC fans can be, right? But I do think that folks are they're informed. I think they generally have a pretty good feel of where the program's at, and I think that more often than not, people you talk to, like, they have a general feel that like South Carolina should be sort of in that middle echelon of the SEC, and that should be that's a good place to be for right now. And I think that you combine that with sort of an informed fan base, a passionate fan base, and all the environment and everything else. I mean, when things are clicking, it's as good a place to watch a football game as anywhere in the country. It's really, really fun.
What do you think it's going to take for South Carolina to truly compete for championships? Like, what needs to happen?
Top 5 recruiting class.
Just recruiting?
I mean, no, and I think I say that sort of tongue in cheek. I think that South Carolina's done a really good job recruiting on the recruiting trail. I mean, they've clearly taken a step up in terms of the guys they're getting. I think that this 2024 class, I think, is going to be a really interesting case study because it's the first class that really the Shane Beamer's staff has had, so not a full cycle, but almost three full years to evaluate and get on and recruit and be on. And I think that they're on pace for a top sort of 15 class. Yeah. At South Carolina, that goes a long way because South Carolina largely is going to be a program where you're going to bring in guys, you're going to get a few high-end guys, but you're going to develop a lot of that talent. If you're bringing up the bottom of that class to a higher level, that carries a lot of weight at a place like South Carolina where you're going to be able to develop that talent. And if you have higher-end talent, it's obviously you're going to develop higher-end products. And I think that, for South Carolina to be in that conversation, I mean, I think quarterback's been a question. Spencer, I think, gives you a chance for sure just because of what he is. I mean, I'm not saying South Carolina's going to win 12 games by any stretch of the imagination right now, but I do think that quarterback's a start. I think that, coaching's a start. I think Shane Beamer's got people behind him, which helps. I think, obviously, the environment's really good. But I do think, the recruiting's on pace. They've done a really good job in the transfer portal for the most part. I think that South Carolina's it's not to the point of like Lane Kiffin and Transfer King and all that, but I do think that South Carolina's done a really good job in the transfer portal, and I think they've been really good and really judicious about taking guys, not in the sense of they're just going to take guys to take guys. They've done a really good job of taking guys to fill holes and filling the right holes, and that's not something that every program does. There's programs that just take guys because they need, it helps a headline or whatever it might be. Not literally, but it can happen. I think South Carolina has hit on a lot more guys than they've missed on in the transfer portal, and that goes a long way, especially when you're trying to get older quickly. So that's a roundabout saying I think there's a lot of things they need to do to win a national championship, but I do think that they're sort of pecking in the right direction, no pun intended. But I do think they're. No, I swear that was not intended.
I'm going to need some more of this.
It's just good podcasting, right? But no, I do think they are doing the right things. I think they're taking a step in the right direction, and for South Carolina, it's go win 10 games. Yeah. It's put yourself in that conversation in mid-November of being in the conversation for an SEC title game or something along those lines. And I think that's the next step. Is that going to happen this year? I don't know. I think if you're South Carolina, you finish 7-5, 8-4 bowl game going forward. Like, that's a pretty good place to be because that's sustained success. 3 years, that's enough to say, okay, that is some sustained success. A little tongue twister there, but so I think that they're moving in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
All right, Ben Portnoy from the state, really appreciate your time. Before you go, can you tell the audience where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, definitely on thestate.com or on Twitter at bportnoy15 or on Threads, I guess now. Is that a thing, right? I think it's the same I think I have the same handle on there, so you can go search it up. So now I got an extra social media thing I got to plug, I guess.
Exactly.
But yeah, go ahead and go there and read all my stuff on thestate.com.
All right, thank you so much, man. That was great.
Appreciate you guys.